The late afternoon sun filtered through the broad leaves of the maple tree Clara had planted years ago, cast dappled patterns across Arthur Finch's worn oak desk. Outside Willow Creek Estates presented its usual facade of suburban perfection, lawns manicured with unnerving precision, matching slate-gray mailboxes standing sentinel at every curb. A quiet broken only by the distant hum of a lawnmower adhering strictly to the approved weekend schedule. It was the kind of community living touted in brochures, but Arthur often felt a subtle tension beneath the surface, a sense of carefully curated order that bordered on oppressive. This house, though nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, was different. It was his. More accurately, it had been theirs. Every corner held an echo of Clara. The window seat where she'd read curled up with a mug of tea, the slight imperfections in the hand-painted kitchen tiles they had chosen together on a trip to Santa Fe, the bookshelves Arthur, a retired architect with a lingering love for craftsmanship, had built to her exact specifications. Since her passing 5 years prior, the house had become more than just shelter. It was a repository of memory, a physical anchor to the best years of his life. Maintaining it, tending the rosebushes she adored, polishing the wood floors they'd installed, these small acts were his quiet rituals of remembrance. That placid routine shattered when the mail arrived. Amidst the usual junk mail and a local newspaper, one envelope stood out. It was thick cream-colored cardstock, bearing the embossed, slightly ostentatious logo of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. It felt heavier than it should, almost ominous. Arthur carried it inside, setting it on the kitchen counter with a vague sense of unease. The HOA rarely sent anything, unless it was a notice of a minor infraction. Grass height exceeding the mandated 3 inches, a recycling bin left out an hour too long, or the bland quarterly newsletter filled with reminders about approved paint colors. He slid it open with a kitchen knife. The paper inside was crisp, the font severe and impersonal. His eyes scanned the first lines, then darted back, disbelief prickling his scalp. Effective immediately, the letter began. Pursuant to a recent board decision regarding necessary community enhancements and reserve fund replenishment. His gaze jumped to the critical line, the number leaping off the page like an electric shock. Your monthly HOA dues will be increased by 500%. 500%. Arthur read it again, then a third time, the words blurring slightly. It wasn't a typo. It was an absurdity, a demand so outrageous it felt like a physical blow. He leaned against the counter, the cool granite doing little to quell the sudden heat rising in his chest. Necessary community enhancements. What enhancements? The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had for the past decade. Meticulously, rigidly the same. Failure to comply, the letter continued in cold bureaucratic prose, would result in penalties, liens, and possible legal action. A slow, quiet anger began to replace the initial shock. It wasn't just the money, though. The amount was staggering, bordering on punitive. It was the arrogance, the sheer audacity of such a demand delivered with zero explanation or justification. Beyond vague platitudes, it felt like a violation, an intrusion into the sanctuary he had so carefully preserved. This wasn't about community living. This felt like extortion, veiled in procedure. Signed at the bottom, not with a personal signature, but a stark typed line. By order of the board, President Eleanor Vance. The name, like the letter itself, felt cold, distant and utterly unconcerned with the lives it was disrupting. Arthur's jaw tightened. His quiet life, his carefully tended memories, they were under siege, and he knew with a certainty that solidified deep in his gut that he couldn't just let this happen. This unfair dues increase, this blatant power grab demanded a response. The Willow Creek Estates HOA office was located in a small, detached brick building near the community clubhouse, a structure Arthur had always found needlessly imposing. Inside, the air conditioning was dialed high, creating a sterile chill that seemed to leach the warmth from the tasteful if generic decor. Beige walls, beige carpet, framed prints of bland landscapes. A large, polished mahogany desk dominated the main room, and behind it sat Eleanor Vance. She looked up as Arthur entered, a brief flicker of assessment in her cool blue eyes before settling into a practiced professional smile that didn't quite soften the severe lines of her face. Eleanor was perhaps in her early 60s, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy pantsuit, her silver hair styled in a precise helmet-like bob. Everything about her radiated crisp efficiency and an unshakable sense of authority. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice smooth but lacking genuine warmth. "What can the association do for you today?" Arthur approached the desk, holding the offending letter. He'd spent the previous evening trying to approach this logically formulating his points, like he would structure an architectural proposal. Mrs. Vance, he began, keeping his tone steady and reasonable. I'm here regarding the recent notice of the dues increase. A 500% increase is unprecedented. I was hoping you could provide some specific details about the necessary community enhancements mentioned, perhaps a breakdown of the costs involved. Eleanor steepled her fingers, her smile tightening almost imperceptibly. Ah, yes, the dues adjustment. A necessary step, Mr. Finch, for the continued fiscal health and long-term enhancement of Willow Creek Estates. The board has identified several key areas requiring investment: infrastructure upkeep, reserve fund stabilization, aligned with best practices and upgrades to maintain our community's premier standing and property values. She delivered the lines smoothly, like rehearsed corporate speak, designed to deflect rather than inform. I understand the need for upkeep, Arthur persisted, placing the letter gently on the desk, but a five-fold increase seems disproportionate without transparent justification. Could the residents perhaps see the bids for these upgrades, or the specific budget outlining these expenditures? Transparency in handling this kind of HOA dispute is usually appreciated. Eleanor's smile finally faltered, replaced by a look of faint impatience, as if dealing with a particularly slow child. Mr. Finch, she said, her voice taking on a condescending edge, masked as patience. The board operates under established procedures and bylaws. These decisions are made after careful deliberation, always prioritizing the collective good, providing granular details to every individual resident on every line. Item simply isn't feasible or efficient. Rest assured, everything is fully compliant and has been approved through the proper channels. She gestured vaguely towards a thick binder on a shelf behind her labeled WCE Bylaws and Procedures, as if its mere presence rendered further questions moot. Arthur felt a familiar frustration rising, the smooth, impenetrable wall of bureaucracy. She hadn't answered a single one of his questions directly. She offered jargon instead of justification, procedure instead of transparency. He saw it then, clear as day in her dismissive gaze. This wasn't a negotiation or a discussion. It was a decree handed down from on high. She wielded the rules like a weapon, clad in the velvet glove of feigned professionalism. Pushing further here using logic and reason would be utterly futile. He was being expertly stonewalled, his valid concerns treated as an inconvenience. He met her gaze, letting a moment of silence hang in the chilly air. His own quiet nature, often mistaken for passivity, began to solidify into something else, a quiet, unyielding resolve. He wouldn't win this battle with polite debate. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Vance, he said, evenly picking up the letter. His voice betrayed none of the simmering determination now hardening within him. He turned and walked out of the sterile office, leaving Eleanor Vance behind her, mahogany fortress already turning back to her computer. The cool air outside felt like a relief. Logic had failed, reason had been dismissed, but Arthur Finch wasn't defeated. He was just beginning to understand the nature of the fight ahead. Challenging these unfair HOA practices would require a different approach entirely. The confrontation with Eleanor Vance had extinguished any hope Arthur had for a simple resolution. That night, fueled by a potent blend of frustration and burgeoning suspicion, he turned his meticulous architect's mind to a new kind of blueprint: the HOA's financial records. As a homeowner, he had access, albeit through a clunky online portal filled with poorly scanned documents and dense spreadsheets. Anger gave way to focused determination. If Eleanor wouldn't provide transparency, he would find it himself. Under the quiet glow of his desk lamp, long after the rest of Willow Creek Estates had fallen silent, Arthur began his financial investigation. He downloaded years' worth of budgets, expense reports, and meeting minutes. At first glance, the document seemed professionally prepared, filled with standard accounting terms. But Arthur's eye for detail, honed over decades of scrutinizing structural plans and cost estimates, soon began catching irregularities. The numbers felt off. He started cross-referencing. The reported income from dues over the past few years didn't seem to logically track with the listed expenditures, especially considering the supposedly healthy reserve fund. Yet when he located the reserve fund statement, the balance was alarmingly low for a community of this size and age. Where had the money gone? He scrolled through expense reports, his frown deepening. Vague line items like administrative services, and community consulting fees appeared repeatedly often for substantial rounded sums with no supporting invoices or detailed descriptions attached. Then a specific name caught his eye, recurring with surprising frequency under vendor payments: Vance Enterprises. The echo of the board, president's name was too coincidental to ignore. He made a note, a small red flag planted in the margin of his own spreadsheet. Who was Vance Enterprises? What services did they provide? The payments listed were for a variety of things: landscaping, oversight, minor repair coordination, even holiday decoration, logistics. Yet Arthur couldn't recall seeing any significant upgrades or even particularly festive decorations in recent years. The meticulous landscaping seemed largely unchanged, handled by the same local company they'd used for ages. He pulled up photos he'd taken around the neighborhood over the years, comparing them to listed expenses. A hefty sum was allocated for clubhouse patio refurbishment last spring, yet the patio furniture looked identical. The concrete still showed the same hairline cracks he remembered from Clara's last summer picnic there. Another charge detailed extensive pruning of the community's oak trees, but the oaks lining the main drive looked as overgrown as ever. The picture emerging wasn't just one of mismanagement. It felt deliberate, like a carefully constructed facade hiding a hollow core. The evidence of corruption was beginning to mount, piece by painstaking piece. The initial sting of the dues increase began to transform into something colder, more analytical. This was no longer just about his money or his sanctuary. It was a puzzle, a complex structure built on deceit, and Arthur felt an intellectual compulsion to understand its flaws, to trace the lines of graft back to their source. The late hours passed unnoticed as he sifted through the digital paper trail, the quiet clicks of his mouse, the only sound breaking the silence. He was uncovering the cracks in Eleanor Vance's perfectly maintained facade, and he suspected they ran deeper than anyone imagined. Arthur's investigation deepened, moving beyond HOA budgets into public records, property tax information, permit, applications filed with the city. He was searching for any discrepancy, any link that might further illuminate the Vance Enterprises payments or explain the missing reserve funds. It was meticulous, often tedious work, scrolling through digital archives late into the night. He found permits for minor landscaping changes that never seemed to happen, but nothing definitive yet. Then, while examining utility records associated with community properties, something unusual caught his eye. Most of the community's shared utilities, streetlights, clubhouse power, were bundled under predictable residential or community accounts. But the small brick building housing the HOA office itself was listed differently. It wasn't part of the standard community grid. It operated under a separate commercial utility account billed directly to the Willow Creek Estates HOA. Arthur paused, leaning closer to the screen. Why a commercial account for such a small administrative office? Perhaps a remnant of old zoning, or maybe just bureaucratic oversight, but coupled with the financial irregularities he'd already uncovered, a daring, unconventional idea sparked in his mind. Commercial accounts often face different levels of scrutiny, especially regarding payment histories and flagged activities. What if the financial discrepancies he suspected, the potential funneling of funds, the vague invoicing from Vance Enterprises, could be linked even tangentially to this specific account? If someone were to suggest to the utility company that this commercial account might be associated with financial mismanagement or even potential fraud within the HOA, it could trigger an automatic review process. And such reviews, particularly when fraud was hinted at, often involved a temporary suspension of service until the matter was clarified, a suspension that could plunge Eleanor Vance's seat of power into darkness and silence. The thought was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. This wasn't just digging for information anymore. It was contemplating direct disruptive action. Arthur pushed back from his desk, pacing the quiet confines of his study. Was this going too far? It wasn't illegal sabotage in the traditional sense, but it felt like weaponizing bureaucracy, bending the rules just as Eleanor seemed to do, albeit for a different purpose. What if it backfired? Could an anonymous tip truly remain anonymous? What if it caused problems for the entire neighborhood, not just the HOA office? He stopped before the bookshelf, holding Clara's favorite novels, his hand hovering over their worn spines. What would she think? She had always valued fairness, but she'd also believed in playing by the rules. Yet the rules here felt rigged. Eleanor Vance had dismissed his legitimate concerns, stonewalled him with practiced ease. The system as it stood protected her, to fight back effectively. Perhaps he needed to step outside the conventional lines. This wasn't about petty revenge. It was about creating leverage, forcing an issue that was being deliberately ignored. It was about disrupting the mechanism of control that Eleanor wielded so arrogantly. His resolve hardened. Conventional methods had failed. He wouldn't stand by and watch his sanctuary, and likely his neighbor's financial stability be compromised by unchecked greed, hiding behind HOA bylaws. He sat back down at his computer, his architect's precision now focused on crafting a message. He opened a new anonymous email account through a secure service. Carefully, deliberately, he composed a brief formal message addressed to the utility company's corporate security or fraud department. He mentioned significant financial irregularities uncovered within the Willow Creek Estates HOA, citing questionable vendor payments and depleted reserve funds, and specifically requested a review of their commercial account associated with the HOA office address, hinting at potential fraudulent fund transfers impacting account payments. He kept it factual, professional, and importantly untraceable back to him. With a deep breath, he hit send. The email vanished into the digital ether. There was no taking it back now. Arthur leaned back in his chair, the silence of the house suddenly feeling heavier. He had crossed a line, moving from observer to active participant in a conflict he never sought, whether it was a spark that would illuminate the truth or ignite an uncontrollable fire he didn't yet know. The next morning, Arthur parked his car on a side street, offering a clear diagonal view of the HOA office building. He sat sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos, a knot of anticipation tightening in his stomach. The sun was bright, the neighborhood already stirring with its usual regulated activity. But the small brick building that served as Eleanor Vance's command center remained inert. No hum of air conditioning, no interior lights visible through the windows. So far, so quiet. Around 8:45 a.m., Eleanor's sleek sedan pulled into the dedicated parking spot. She emerged looking as composed as ever, smoothing the lapels of her jacket, clutching a leather portfolio. Two other familiar faces from the HOA board, a stern-looking man named Henderson and a perpetually nervous woman named Davies, arrived moments later in separate cars. They exchanged brief pleasantries, their voices too distant for Arthur to hear, and headed towards the entrance. Arthur watched intently as Eleanor reached the door. There was a slight pause. She tried the handle again. Henderson peered through the glass. Davies fidgeted. The automatic lights that usually illuminated the entryway remained stubbornly dark. Confusion flickered across their faces. Eleanor produced a key, manually unlocking the door, and pushed it open into the dim interior. They stepped inside, disappearing from Arthur's view for a moment. He didn't have to wait long. They re-emerged, their earlier composure replaced with visible agitation. Henderson was frowning deeply, gesturing towards the silent light fixtures. Davies looked flustered, wringing her hands slightly. Eleanor, however, projected pure, controlled fury. Her face was tight, her posture rigid. She pulled out her cell phone, stabbing at the screen with sharp, angry movements. Arthur could imagine the scene inside. Dead computers, no internet, no lights, no climate control. The technological heart of Eleanor's meticulously controlled operation had been silenced. He watched as she paced back and forth on the sidewalk, phone pressed to her ear. Her voice, even from a distance, sounded sharp, demanding. She made one call, then another, her movements becoming increasingly jerky. The mask of unflappable authority was cracking under the pressure of simple inconvenience, magnified by her dependence on seamless operation. At one point, after a particularly long call, she lowered the phone slowly, her expression shifting from anger to something closer to disbelief, then morphing into barely concealed panic. She turned abruptly to Henderson and Davies, her voice carrying now sharp and brittle in the morning air. "They're saying, an account review, pending investigation, financial irregularities. This is outrageous. It could take weeks." Weeks! Arthur let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It had worked. His anonymous email, a calculated gamble, had triggered the exact bureaucratic paralysis he'd hoped for. Seeing Eleanor Vance, usually so imperious, so dismissive, standing helpless and sputtering on the sidewalk outside her darkened office, brought a surge of grim satisfaction. It was a small taste of the powerlessness she inflicted on others. This was the consequence of corruption, brought home in a way she couldn't ignore or dismiss. Yet beneath the satisfaction lay a tremor of apprehension. This was a significant escalation. He had directly interfered, caused a tangible disruption. What unforeseen consequences might ripple outwards from this? Would it truly lead to exposure or just temporary chaos? He watched Eleanor gesturing angrily, directing Henderson and Davies back towards their cars. Her empire momentarily reduced to a locked, powerless building. The power play had succeeded, but Arthur knew this victory was just the opening move in a much larger, more dangerous game. The real battle was only just beginning. The sight of Eleanor Vance Henderson and Davies departing in frustration from the darkened HOA office didn't go unnoticed for long. Willow Creek Estates operated on routine, and anything disrupting that fragile order drew attention. Mrs. Gable from across the street paused her meticulous weeding, peering over her rose bushes. Young Mr. Chen, walking his beagle, stopped mid-stride, tilting his head towards the silent building. A low murmur began to ripple through the immediate vicinity. Questions whispered between neighbors, out retrieving their mail or walking their dogs. "Did you see that? Is something wrong at the HOA?" Arthur watched this growing awareness from his car, the engine now off. He knew this was a critical juncture. Leaving the situation unexplained could lead to rumors, confusion, or worse, allow Eleanor to spin her own narrative later. He needed allies, people who might understand the implications beyond a simple power outage. He spotted Maria Flores pushing her youngest in a stroller down the sidewalk. Her expression clouded with concern as she glanced towards the HOA office. A few houses down, Sam Carpenter was meticulously inspecting the sprinkler heads on his lawn, his movements deliberate and unhurried, taking a deep breath. Arthur got out of his car, adopting a casual air he didn't feel. He timed his approach to coincide with Maria pausing near Sam's driveway. "Morning, Maria, Sam," he said, his voice calm. "Quite the situation over there, isn't it?" Maria jumped slightly, then offered a hesitant smile. "Arthur, yes, strange. Power outage, do you think?" Sam straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. His gaze was shrewd as he looked from the office to Arthur. "Looks like more than just a tripped breaker," he commented dryly. Saw Eleanor leave in quite a state. This was Arthur's opening. He lowered his voice slightly, leaning in conspiratorially. "It might be more complicated," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I've been looking into the HOA finances recently. You know, because of that outrageous dues increase. There are irregularities, significant ones." He briefly outlined his findings: the depleted reserve fund, the questionable payments to Vance Enterprises, the inflated administrative costs that didn't seem to match any visible improvements. He didn't explicitly claim responsibility for the outage, but he let the implication hang in the air. Financial trouble might have consequences. Maria's eyes widened, her hand tightening on the stroller handle. She glanced nervously towards the empty HOA office, then back at Arthur. Seeing Eleanor flustered and powerless seemed to unlock something within her. "Vance Enterprises." She whispered the name, triggering a memory. "Eleanor, she made us use a company with a similar name, Vance Landscaping Solutions, a few years back when she claimed our retaining wall wasn't up to code. Cost us a fortune, and honestly the work wasn't even that good." Her voice trembled slightly, years of quiet intimidation bubbling to the surface. "She threatened fines if we didn't comply immediately." Sam listened intently, his expression growing grim. He nodded slowly as Arthur spoke about the reserves and vague costs. "Figures," he muttered almost to himself. "Always wondered where the money went. Remember those upgraded pathway lights they installed 2 years back? Cheap fixtures, half of them burned out within 6 months. Never made sense for the cost they claimed." He looked directly at Arthur, his practical mind connecting the dots. "So, you think this power outage is tied to that, to the money?" Arthur met Sam's gaze, giving a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "It's possible financial flags were raised with the utility company," he said carefully. "Accounts under review sometimes get suspended." A moment of charged silence fell between the three of them. The shared information, Maria's tentatively voiced grievance, Sam's practical assessment. It felt like a spark catching hold. The initial whispers of confusion were starting to coalesce into something more substantial, fueled by suspicion and shared frustration. The seeds of collective action, unknowingly sown by Arthur's anonymous email, were beginning to take root on the quiet suburban street. The conversation between Arthur, Maria, and Sam hadn't gone unnoticed. Mrs. Gable abandoned her weeding entirely, drifting closer with undisguised curiosity. Mr. Chen tied his beagle to a lamppost and joined the periphery. Others, sensing something more than just a utility issue, was unfolding began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the unusual cluster of neighbors and the palpable tension surrounding the dark HOA office. What began as whispers was quickly escalating into open discussion, fueled by shared anecdotes of minor frustrations that now seemed potentially linked to a larger pattern of mismanagement. Just then, phones began buzzing collectively. A mass email alert blinked onto screens sent from Eleanor Vance's personal account, Arthur saw. Maria glanced down at hers, her lips thinning. The message, hastily typed and riddled with corporate jargon, vaguely blamed the power outage on an unforeseen external utility provider issue, and assured residents that the board was actively liaising to resolve the temporary inconvenience. It promised updates in due course, and reminded everyone to adhere to community guidelines. The attempt to control the narrative fell flat. Instead of reassurance, it sparked irritation. "External issue," scoffed Mr. Chen. "Looked like she couldn't even get in the building," Mrs. Gable added. "And still no explanation for that ridiculous dues letter." Eleanor's usual tactic of opaque pronouncements designed to quell dissent through sheer authority seemed hollow without the operational power base of her office behind her. Her authority, usually projected effortlessly, now rang hollow, transmitted weekly through impersonal emails, seeing the collective skepticism. Maria straightened her shoulders, her earlier hesitation replaced by a newfound boldness. "It's not just the dues or this power outage," she declared, her voice carrying clearly now, drawing the attention of the growing group. "Remember last year the mandatory tree trimming assessment? Eleanor claimed an arborist recommended immediate costly work on several oaks for safety reasons. My neighbor, Mr. Henderson, no relation to the board member, is a retired arborist himself. He looked at those trees and said they needed minimal pruning at most. But when he tried to question it, Eleanor threatened him with non-compliance fines and accused him of interfering." A murmur of recognition went through the small crowd. Others nodded, recalling the sudden expensive assessment. Someone else chimed in about questionable charges for pool maintenance when the pool had been closed for extended periods. The dam of years of accumulated, often unspoken grievances seemed to be breaking. People weren't just frustrated anymore. They were angry, feeling exploited and deliberately misled. This wasn't just about a power outage or a dues hike. It was about years of HOA mismanagement and autocratic rule. As the indignant chatter swelled, Sam Carpenter held up a hand, his expression thoughtful. He'd been quiet, observing the rising tide of community anger. "Wait a minute," he said, slowly rubbing his chin. "That assessment, the way she pushed it through, it reminds me of something." He paused, concentrating. "A few years back, I had a dispute with her over a fence stain. She insisted on a specific brand that cost twice as much. I dug into the bylaws, then looking for loopholes." And his eyes lit up with sudden recollection. "There's a section in there, Article 9, I think, maybe X. It deals with emergency provisions. Specifically, it outlines the process for calling an immediate vote of homeowners to remove the board." He looked around at the assembled neighbors, his voice gaining certainty. "If there's evidence, credible evidence, of financial misconduct or gross mismanagement impacting the community, it requires a certain number of signatures, but it bypasses the usual meeting schedules." A stunned silence fell over the group, quickly replaced by a buzz of excited energy. A bylaw, a tool within the very system Eleanor used to control them, now potentially usable against her. Sam, the pragmatic former inspector, had just provided not just validation for their anger, but a concrete procedural path forward. The fire of discontent kindled by Arthur's investigation and fanned by Maria's courage now had a clear direction. Sam Carpenter's revelation about the emergency bylaw hung in the air, electric with possibility. The disgruntled murmurs shifted, taking on a sharper edge of hope. "Are you sure, Sam?" Mrs. Gable asked, her voice eager. "A vote, we could actually remove her." "Pretty sure," Sam confirmed, nodding. "Article X, Section 3, if memory serves, financial misconduct is the key trigger." Just as the implications began to sink in, Maria Flores spoke up, pulling out her phone. "I know someone," she said, her voice firmer than before. "An attorney, Julian Thorne. I consulted him briefly last year about another issue with Eleanor. He specializes in HOA disputes. He said then I didn't have enough proof for a case, but maybe now." Her fingers flew across the screen as she typed a quick message, explaining the situation and the potential evidence. Less than half an hour later, a dark sedan pulled up quietly down the street. A man in a well-cut suit carrying a slim briefcase stepped out. He was perhaps in his late 40s, with sharp eyes and an air of focused professionalism. This was Julian Thorne. Maria waved him over, and the crowd parted slightly, a sense of anticipation hushing their conversations. Maria quickly introduced Arthur and Sam, summarizing the morning's events. The power outage, the dues increase, the shared grievances, and Sam's recollection of the bylaw. Arthur then stepped forward, presenting Thorne with a concise summary of his findings printed out from his late-night research. The pattern of payments to Vance Enterprises, the inexplicably low reserve fund figures, examples of inflated costs for non-existent work. He kept it factual, objective, the evidence laid bare. Thorne listened intently. Scanning the pages, Arthur provided his expression neutral but focused. He asked a couple of clarifying questions, his inquiries sharp and precise. Then he looked up, meeting the hopeful, anxious gazes of the assembled residents. "Mr. Carpenter is correct," Thorne stated, his voice calm but carrying authority. "Most well-drafted bylaws include provisions for emergency removal of the board under specific circumstances, and proven financial misconduct is almost always one of them. What Mr. Finch has gathered here," he tapped the papers Arthur had given him, "while preliminary, appears to constitute credible evidence sufficient to invoke that clause." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Furthermore," he continued, "if this evidence holds up under audit, the legal ramifications for Mrs. Vance and potentially other board members could be severe. We're talking about potential civil action to recover misappropriated funds, personal liability. Depending on the extent of the misconduct proven, there could even be grounds to petition for the dissolution of the HOA, entirely freeing the community from its control." The impact was immediate. Thorne's words, delivered with professional certainty, transformed the atmosphere. The scattered anger and frustration coalesced into a unified sense of purpose. This wasn't just wishful thinking or mob frustration anymore. It was a legitimate, legally sanctioned pathway. They had leverage. They had rights. "Well, what are we waiting for?" Mr. Chen exclaimed, voicing the thought on everyone's mind. "Where's this petition? Let's get those signatures." As if summoned by the collective will, someone produced a clipboard and a stack of blank paper. Another resident offered pens. Immediately a line formed. People stepped forward eagerly, signing their names with firm strokes, their faces set with determination. Arthur watched the scene unfold, a complex mix of emotions swirling within him. His quiet, solitary investigation had sparked this collective fire, and now, validated by legal expertise, it was blazing into organized action. The weight of responsibility felt immense, but seeing the determined faces of his neighbors, finally empowered to act, brought a profound sense of validation. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, victory felt truly possible. The effect of Julian Thorne's legal validation was instantaneous and electrifying. What had been a hesitant coalescence of frustration became a surge of unified purpose. The clipboard filled with signatures at an astonishing speed. People who hadn't yet emerged from their homes were called jogging over to add their names. Within an hour, they had far exceeded the minimum requirement stipulated in Article Text, Section 3. There was no question. The emergency vote was happening. Using the emergency provisions outlined in the bylaws themselves, bypassing the need for Eleanor's approval or standard notification periods, the vote was scheduled for that very evening. The location chosen felt symbolic, the community park adjacent to the still-darkened HOA office. As dusk began to settle, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured grass, residents converged. Someone brought a folding table, setting it up under the sprawling branches of an old oak tree. Another produced battery-powered lanterns, casting pools of warm light in the gathering twilight. People brought lawn chairs, blankets, thermoses of coffee. The atmosphere wasn't one of anger anymore. It was charged with tense anticipation, a hopeful energy that buzzed almost palpably in the air. Volunteers quickly drafted simple paper ballots. Remove current board, yes, no. Sam Carpenter, Maria Flores, and a couple of other trusted residents agreed to oversee the process, ensuring transparency. A simple cardboard box served as the ballot box off to the side, standing apart from the main gathering, were Eleanor, Vance, Henderson, and Davies. They watched the proceedings with expressions that mingled disbelief and impotent fury. Eleanor's usual mask of cool control had completely vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped, pale rage. She paced short distances occasionally, whispering venomously to Henderson, who stood rigidly, arms crossed, glaring at the homeowners. Davies just looked lost, her eyes darting nervously between Eleanor and the growing crowd assembling to dismantle their power structure. They were isolated, ostracized, witnessing the very rules they'd manipulated being turned against them by the people they'd underestimated. Their presence served only to underscore the completeness of their downfall. One by one, residents approached the folding table, received a ballot marked it decisively, folded it, and dropped it into the box. There was a quiet solemnity to the process, a sense of reclaiming something long denied. Husbands and wives, young families, retirees, the diverse fabric of Willow Creek Estates united in a single focused action. Arthur stood towards the back, observing the steady stream of voters. He felt a profound sense of detachment, mixed with deep involvement he hadn't sought. This hadn't wanted to be a leader yet. His quiet pursuit of fairness had inadvertently ignited this powerful display of community action. When the last ballot was cast, a hush fell over the park. Sam and Maria carefully tipped the contents of the box onto the table under the lantern light. Methodically, they unfolded each slip of paper, creating two distinct piles. The yes pile grew steadily, towering over the small stack of no votes, likely cast only by Eleanor and her few remaining loyalists. The counting was swift, the outcome undeniable long before the final tally was complete. Sam cleared his throat, stepping forward. The park was utterly silent, every face turned towards him. "The results are in," he announced, his voice clear and steady. "By an overwhelming majority. The motion to remove the current HOA board of directors passes." For a heartbeat, there was stunned silence, as if the reality was too sudden to fully absorb. Then the release came. A cheer erupted, swelling instantly into a wave of applause, whoops, and laughter that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. People clapped each other on the back, hugged neighbors they barely knew, shook hands with, relieved smiles. Tears welled in Maria's eyes as she embraced Mrs. Gable. Sam allowed himself a broad grin. Years of suppressed frustration, petty fines, and arrogant dismissals seemed to evaporate in that single cathartic moment. Arthur watched the celebration, a slow smile spreading across his own face. He saw Eleanor Vance turn sharply on her heel and stride away into the darkness, Henderson and Davies trailing uncertainly behind her. Swallowed by the night, her reign built on intimidation and obscured finances was definitively over-ended, not by a corporate takeover or a legal loophole exploited by an outsider, but by the collective will of the very people she had tried to control. He had simply provided the spark. The community itself had fanned it into an undeniable flame. The euphoria of the previous night's vote gave way to the sober reality of the task ahead. The HOA board had been ousted, but the structure and its tangled finances remained. First thing the next morning, an interim committee was formed, comprised of volunteers like Sam Carpenter, Maria Flores, and a few other residents known for their level heads and specific skills. An accountant, a retired office manager. Their immediate priority, guided by Julian Thorne, was to secure every piece of documentation from the now accessible HOA office. Sam, with his practical know-how, organized, getting a locksmith to change the locks, immediately preventing any potential interference from the ousted board members. Inside, the office felt like a hastily abandoned ship. Files were disorganized, some drawers were suspiciously empty, but the core financial records, both physical and digital, on the now repowered computer systems were largely intact. It seemed Eleanor in her arrogance likely never imagined needing to thoroughly purge her records. With the records secured, the next step was crucial. A comprehensive independent financial audit. Julian Thorne recommended a reputable forensic accounting firm specializing in uncovering fraud. The interim committee, using emergency funds accessible. Now that they had control, formally engaged their services. The auditors descended on the records with professional detachment, beginning the painstaking process of tracing every dollar in and out over the past several years. What they began uncovering within days shocked even those prepared for the worst. Arthur's initial findings about Vance Enterprises were just the tip of the iceberg. The auditors quickly identified several other recurring payments made to vaguely named entities: Community Logistics Solutions, Premier Property Oversight, which upon closer inspection turned out to be shell companies. These companies had no physical addresses beyond P.O. boxes, no discernible employees, and bank accounts linked through a series of complex transfers back to accounts controlled directly by Eleanor Vance, and to a lesser extent Henderson. The evidence of embezzlement was blatant and extensive. Inflated invoices for non-existent services, Consulting fees paid for no discernible work funds, siphoned off systematically for years. But the most damning discovery came buried deep within a folder of old loan applications. Eleanor had secretly taken out a substantial loan in the HOA's name 2 years prior, purportedly for capital improvements. The funds, however, had never been used for any community project. Instead, they appeared to have vanished into the same network of shell accounts, leaving the HOA saddled with significant debt few residents even knew existed. The scale of the financial fraud was staggering, far exceeding the initial suspicions. It wasn't just mismanagement, it was calculated long-term theft. Armed with the auditor's preliminary findings, Julian Thorne wasted no time drafting and filing a robust civil lawsuit against Eleanor Vance and Henderson personally, citing fraud, embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty, and seeking recovery of all misappropriated funds plus damages. The community freed from Eleanor's rule now faced the daunting task of untangling the complex financial wreckage she had left behind, determined to pursue justice and reclaim what had been stolen. News of the civil lawsuit filed against Eleanor Vance and Henderson spread through Willow Creek Estates like wildfire. The specific details emerging from the forensic audit, the shell companies, the secret loan, the sheer scale of the embezzlement, were shared discreetly among residents, solidifying their sense of righteous vindication. Whispers also began circulating about potential criminal charges, as Julian Thorne had forwarded the audit findings to the district attorney's office, citing clear evidence of fraud. The legal system, often perceived as slow-moved, with surprising swiftness in response to the blatant evidence. A judge granted Thorne's request for an immediate injunction, freezing Eleanor Vance's known personal assets, bank accounts, investments, pending the outcome of the lawsuit. The aim was to prevent her from hiding or further dissipating funds that rightfully belonged to the HOA and its members. Simultaneously, investigators began looking closely at Vance Enterprises. Faced with potential complicity charges and intense legal pressure, rumors surfaced that Eleanor's nephew, who officially ran the sham company, was cooperating with authorities, likely cutting a deal to save himself by testifying against his aunt. For Eleanor, the carefully constructed world she had built through manipulation and theft was collapsing entirely. Stripped of her position, facing lawsuits and potential criminal prosecution, and with her assets frozen, she was facing financial ruin. The court indicated that significant restitution would be required. Her most substantial asset, the oversized house she lorded over within Willow Creek Estates itself, ironically paid for and lavishly maintained over the years, with funds likely siphoned from her neighbors, was designated for forced sale to cover a portion of the misappropriated funds. When Arthur learned the house was going on the market under court order, his initial reaction wasn't triumph, but a thoughtful pause. Seeing Eleanor punished was one thing, but the house itself represented something else, an opportunity. He thought about the families he knew, who struggled with the high cost of housing in the area. Instead of letting the house simply be flipped for profit, perhaps it could serve a better purpose. Remembering a local nonprofit he'd supported in the past, Haven Homes, which specialized in acquiring and renovating properties to create affordable housing for working families and veterans, Arthur made a call. He explained the situation, a court-ordered sale, a potentially motivated seller, the court, and a chance to turn a symbol of greed into a beacon of community support. The Haven Homes director was immediately interested. Arthur's focus had shifted. The scales of justice were tipping against Eleanor, but he was now looking beyond retribution towards rebuilding and creating something positive from the wreckage. In the months following Eleanor Vance's downfall and the dissolution of the HOA, a quiet transformation swept through Willow Creek Estates. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a collaborative spirit. Neighbors organized volunteer committees to manage essential upkeep. Sam Carpenter naturally took charge of overseeing necessary repairs, while Maria Flores helped coordinate landscaping efforts. Rules became guidelines enforced by common sense rather than punitive fines. Yards blossomed with individual expression, paint colors diversified, and the sterile uniformity gave way to a warmer, more lived-in feel. The shared spaces, once symbols of Eleanor's control, became hubs of genuine community activity. The court-ordered auction of Eleanor's house was a significant event Arthur attended, along with several other residents watching quietly, as the Haven Homes nonprofit, armed with community-supported donations and their own funds, placed the winning bid. There was a shared sense of quiet satisfaction in knowing the house wouldn't just pass to another owner, but would serve a purpose rooted in community well-being. Haven Homes began renovations almost immediately, stripping away the gaudy, unnecessary additions Eleanor had made, restoring the house to a simpler, welcoming state. Months passed. The legal proceedings against Eleanor continued slowly, grinding towards their conclusion, but for the residents the focus had shifted forward. One crisp autumn afternoon, Arthur sat on his porch, nursing a cup of tea, watching a moving truck unload furniture down the street. At Eleanor's former house, a young couple emerged laughing as they directed the movers. Two small children chased each other across the lawn, their joyful shrieks echoing in the quiet air, a sound that would have likely earned their parents a citation under the old regime. They were a young family, a teacher and a firefighter, who had struggled to find affordable housing. Nearby Haven Homes had made it possible. A deep sense of peace settled over Arthur, profound and quiet. Watching the new family begin their life in the house that had once been a symbol of division felt like the final necessary step in the neighborhood's healing. He hadn't just defended his own sanctuary, the repository of his memories with Clara. He had inadvertently helped to tear down walls, both literal and figurative, fostering a connection with his neighbors he hadn't known was possible. His quiet home was still his anchor, but now it felt part of something larger, something healthier and more resilient. He had found closure not just in seeing justice done, but in witnessing the foundations of a true community being laid anew. This story beautifully illustrates that even quiet strength can reshape our world. Like Arthur meticulously uncovering facts before acting, we learn that preparation is power. Don't underestimate the impact of doing your homework when facing a challenge, whether it's a workplace issue or a personal goal. The narrative also shows that courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting despite it. Arthur stepped far outside his comfort zone, reminding us that meaningful change often requires taking calculated risks. Crucially, Arthur didn't act entirely alone. His willingness to share information ignited collective action. This teaches us the vital importance of community and collaboration. Uniting with others amplifies individual effort exponentially. When facing unfairness, seek allies and share your knowledge. Finally, the transformation of Eleanor's house into affordable housing demonstrates that even from negative situations, we can seek opportunities for positive impact and constructive change. Embrace these lessons, find your voice through preparation, act courageously, connect with others, and always look for ways to build something better. From adversity, you have the power to influence your own story and community.